The wedding convoy had been on the road for 6 minutes when Terence Okafor stepped off the curb on Glenwood Avenue in Decatur, Georgia, and stood in front of the lead car with his arms at his sides and his phone in his right hand, and did not move. The driver hit the brakes. The music cut. The ribbons on the hood kept swaying for a moment after everything else stopped, the way things do when the world changes faster than the decorations can catch up. 200 people in their best clothes turned to look at a single man standing alone in the middle of the road on a Saturday afternoon in June, and the first thing most of them thought was, somebody's having a breakdown. They were wrong about the breakdown. They were right that something was coming apart. Terence waited until the noise settled into silence. Then he said her name. Celestine Adiz Nwosu. He said it the way you say something you have rehearsed until the rehearsal is gone and what's left is just the truth of it. Then he said the rest. That the woman in that car in that white dress, sitting next to a man named Gordon Ibarra who owned a trucking company in Norcross and believed he was 2 miles from the happiest moment of his life. That woman had been sitting across from Terence Okafor at a restaurant on Candler Road 8 weeks ago, holding his hand across the table, telling him she was ready to stop running and build something real. That she had taken $3,400 from him across 6 weeks. That she had accepted his proposal. That she had kissed him in his own kitchen the Tuesday before last and told him she had never felt this certain about anything. He said, "I have proof, I have records, and I am not the only one." The crowd didn't know how to metabolize that. Some of them laughed the wrong kind of laugh, the reflexive kind, the one that happens when the brain needs a second to decide if something is a joke or a catastrophe. Some of them started filming immediately. The groom's people surged forward, cousins, friends, a broad-shouldered man in a cream suit who looked like he handled situations professionally. And their voices were low and controlled in the way that means the anger underneath is not low and not controlled at all. Terence did not move. He had known they would come. He had factored them into the decision he made when he got in his car that morning, the same way he had factored in the police, the humiliation, the possibility that he would stand here and say everything and not be believed and have to live with that. He had factored all of it in and gotten in the car anyway. He said, "I'm not leaving until Gordon Ibarra sees what I'm holding. After that, I'll go wherever you want me to go." To understand what Terence was holding, you have to understand what Celestine Adiz Nwosu actually was. Not what she looked like, not the resume she handed every new man she found, what she actually was. She was 34 years old, and she had been running variations of the same operation across the American Southeast for 3 years. And she was good at it, the way a surgeon is good at surgery. Not through recklessness but through precision, through understanding exactly where the incision should be made and exactly how deep to go before pulling back. She had grown up in Houston, Texas, the second of 4 children, and somewhere between Houston and the first city, she had run this in Nashville in 2021. She had developed a theory about men that she had tested and refined until it was less a theory and more a working system. The theory was this: a certain kind of man has built his life around being useful. He has learned that the way you earn your place in the world is by solving problems, providing for people, showing up reliably and delivering. He has organized his identity around those things. He is, in the truest sense, a good man. And a good man, when he encounters a woman who presents him with solvable problems and genuine warmth, and the particular vulnerability of someone who has been through hard things and survived them with her softness intact, that man does not stand a chance. Not because he is stupid, because he is exactly who he worked his whole life to become. She didn't pick wealthy men. Wealthy men have armor, accountants who ask questions, attorneys who review things, friends who have enough experience with the world to be appropriately skeptical of what looks too good. Celestine picked men who were solid, men who owned small businesses or held senior positions in companies they hadn't founded, men who had something real but had built it through their own effort and hadn't yet accumulated the particular caution that sometimes comes with wealth. Men who were in many cases recently single, not fresh wounds, nothing raw. but men who had been alone long enough that the loneliness had become invisible to them, absorbed into the background of their daily lives, and who had stopped actively looking because stopping felt more dignified than wanting and not finding. She found them in churches, always churches. The black church in the American South has a specific social architecture. It is one of the few places where a single man of a certain age can encounter a single woman of a certain age in a context that is implicitly about values and community and long-term thinking, and where the introduction carries a pre-attached legitimacy that a dating app or a bar simply cannot provide. The church said, "She is here for the right reasons. She is the kind of woman who shows up on Saturday mornings to volunteer. She is looking for something real." All of that was true in its way. She was looking for something. She did show up on Saturday mornings. The reasons were just different from what anyone assumed. She moved cities every 4 to 6 months. Atlanta to Charlotte to Memphis to Birmingham to Nashville and back and around again. Careful never to return to a city too soon. Careful about which churches she attended and which she avoided. Careful about the specific neighborhoods where she established herself, because the black professional community in any southern city is, at a certain level, smaller than it appears, and reputation travels in ways that don't always announce themselves. She had done this 14 times before Terence Okafor. The combined total was somewhere north of $200,000. The actual number was impossible to establish precisely because several of the men, she knew this about them, she had assessed it in advance, would never report it, would never attach their names to a public accounting of how they had been moved through, would absorb the loss quietly and privately and tell themselves a story about it that allowed them to function, because the alternative was to say out loud that they had loved someone who had been clocking them from the first handshake, and some losses are too specifically shaped to be spoken. Terence Okafor was 46 years old and owned a plumbing and HVAC company, indicator that he had built from nothing over 18 years. 31 employees. A reputation in the area that meant the phone rang without advertising, which is the kind of reputation that takes a long time to build and means something real when you have it. He had been married once in his early 30s to a woman named Portia, and it had ended without violence or betrayal, just two people who had grown at different angles and had the decency to recognize it before it became damage. He had been alone for 11 years, not unhappily most of the time. He had his work and his men and his church community in Stone Mountain and a brother in Marietta he saw every other Sunday for football and food. He met Celestine on a Thursday evening in April at a church fundraiser dinner, at a round table near the back of the fellowship hall, where neither of them had chosen to be particularly, and yet there they were. She was at the table with two women he recognized vaguely and one he didn't, and she was listening to something one of them was saying with the specific quality of attention that you notice when you're used to people performing attention rather than actually paying it. Her eyes didn't move around the room. She didn't check her phone. She just listened, and then she said something that made the woman across from her laugh in a way that seemed surprised, and then she went back to listening. Terence noticed all of that and told himself he wasn't going to do anything with it. He had his food and his conversation, and he went home at 9:30 and didn't think about her much on the drive. He saw her again the following Saturday morning at the church's community breakfast, helping in the kitchen in jeans and a plain green top with her hair pulled back, filling trays and moving with the efficient purposefulness of someone who has done this enough times that the tasks are automatic. She looked like she had shown up at 7 in the morning to feed strangers, because it was simply the thing to do that morning. He introduced himself before he left. She shook his hand, a real handshake, not the delicate version, a handshake that said she was present, and told him her name and said she had noticed him at the dinner last week, but had been seated too far away to introduce herself. The conversation was 20 minutes and covered nothing remarkable. Her family was Nigerian. She had grown up partly in Houston and partly in Fort Worth. She worked in healthcare administration. She had been in Atlanta 8 months. He asked if she would like to have dinner. She said she would. She gave him her number without hesitation, without the performance of reluctance, and went back to the kitchen. Terence drove home thinking about the handshake, He was not a man who spent much time thinking about women he had just met. He noticed the thought and told himself it didn't have to mean anything, and then found himself thinking about dinner options before he had left the parking lot. Their first dinner was at a place he liked in Kirkwood, not expensive but good, the kind of restaurant that is a statement about having taste without needing to prove it. She ordered without studying the menu too long, and without the performance of ordering modestly that can feel either charming or calculated. She asked him about his company with questions specific enough to show she had processed what he mentioned in conversation rather than waiting for her own turn to speak. She talked about herself the way people talk when they have learned that selective openness is more effective than full disclosure. Enough to feel real, shaped to reveal almost nothing that could be checked. She mentioned growing up between Houston and Fort Worth. She mentioned a younger brother she was close to. She mentioned that her parents' marriage had been long and complicated, and that she had spent most of her adult life figuring out what she actually wanted rather than what she had been taught to want, and she said it with a rueful self-awareness that made it feel like honesty. By the time the check came, Terence was interested in the specific way that feels different from ordinary interest. Not just attracted, not just curious but compelled, pulled toward someone as though there is more to find. He was right about that. There was more to find. He just didn't know yet what kind of more it was. She waited 5 weeks before she mentioned money for the first time. She did not ask. This was not a small distinction. Asking creates a transaction, and a transaction creates a timestamp in the mind of the person being asked, a moment they can locate later and understand with clarity. What Celestine did instead was share a problem the way you share something with a person you trust, which meant she did it with visible reluctance and a specific quality of pain at having to say it at all. They were sitting on his porch on a Sunday evening, the kind of warm Atlanta evening that smells like cut grass and somewhere in the distance someone is grilling, and she had been quiet for a few minutes in a way that he had learned meant she was carrying something. He asked what was going on. She said she was fine. He waited. She said it was just a situation with her brother back in Fort Worth, nothing she couldn't handle, she didn't want to bring it into their evening. He said, "Celestine, tell me." Medical debt. Her brother had a gap in insurance coverage, and there was a bill that had just gone to collections, and she had been trying to figure out the right move, and it was just, she was trying not to let it be a distraction. She was handling it. She was sorry to bring it up. Terence said, "How much?" She said, "No, that's not why I'm telling you." He said, "I know why you're telling me, how much?" She told him $900. He opened his banking app right there on the porch and transferred it before she could say anything else. She looked at his phone and then looked at him and said nothing for a moment, and then she said something she had learned, over years of practice, was worth more than any amount of gratitude. She said, "I don't know what I did to deserve you in my life right now." He said, "You don't have to do anything, I'm just glad I can help." She reached over and held his hand in the warm evening air, and the hold was warm and real, and meant precisely what it needed to mean in that moment. $900, the first number, also an assessment. She had watched him carefully for 5 weeks and she knew he would not hesitate, knew it from the way he engaged with problems, the way his mind moved immediately toward solution rather than analysis when someone he cared about needed something. She had chosen correctly. The hesitation she had been prepared to manage did not materialize. He solved it the way he solved everything, swiftly and without making it about himself. 3 weeks later, her car needed a repair. The mechanic had found something in the inspection she hadn't expected, something with the brake system, not optional, not the kind of thing you let go. She had most of it covered, but she was short by $1,400, and payday wasn't until Friday, and the car was her only transportation to work. She showed him the mechanic's estimate on her phone. The document looked exactly like a real mechanic's estimate, because she had spent an evening making sure it did. He transferred $1,400 without asking the mechanic's name, without offering to take the car in himself. He trusted her, the way you trust someone when the relationship is still in that early stage where trust is how you prove that you're worth trusting, and she had understood from the beginning that this stage, handled correctly, was the most valuable stage of all. Then, a month after that, a licensing issue with her employer. A credentialing gap, a bill, a deadline, $2,200. He didn't hesitate. He transferred it before she finished explaining. That was when she knew she was ahead of schedule. He did not connect the transactions to each other. This was not stupidity. This was the specific arithmetic of love, which does not add up the way other arithmetic does. Each transaction existed in its own emotional context, separated from the last by enough time and enough genuine warmth that the numbers never accumulated into an image. He was not giving money to a woman who was taking it. He was helping someone he loved with problems as they arose. Those are the same action, and they are entirely different experiences, and the difference is everything. She let 2 months pass with nothing asked and everything continuing warmly: dinners, Sunday afternoons, a weekend trip to Savannah that she had suggested, and he had planned and paid for, which she had anticipated he would do and had allowed for in her accounting. During those 2 months she was, within the specific boundaries of what she was doing, good company. She was genuinely funny. She was a good listener. The Savannah weekend had real moments in it that were not manufactured, and she knew this and allowed herself to have them, because the warmth she generated was more convincing when she didn't have to entirely construct it. The engagement happened the way she needed it to happen, which meant she didn't engineer it directly. She began talking about the future with the casual specificity of someone who assumes a shared one, dropping it into conversation the way you drop familiar objects into a familiar space. She said things like, "When we have more room, and I've been thinking about what I actually want from the next 10 years in a way that assumed he was in them." She let those assumptions accumulate until they were simply the weather between them. Terence proposed on a Wednesday night in his living room with a ring from a jeweler in Decatur that a client had recommended. He had not planned a production. He had just known, sitting across from her over takeout, that he wanted to stop living in a future that was theoretical and start living in one that was decided. She said yes the way she said most things, without theatre, just directly, and then she looked at him with an expression that he would spend a long time later trying to understand. What she was feeling in that moment was not nothing. She had been doing this long enough to know the difference, and what she felt when Terence Okafor put that ring on her finger was not nothing. It was not love the way he meant love, but it was something. The closest word she would ever find for it years later was recognition, the feeling of seeing someone clearly and knowing that you have been seen in return, even if what they are seeing is not entirely real. It was the most honest feeling the operation ever produced, and it was also the signal that the operation was almost complete. The deposit conversation happened 12 days after the engagement. She had found a venue, she said, a beautiful space in Inman Park, exactly the kind of setting she had always pictured, not lavish, just meaningful, the right size, the right light in the late afternoon. There had been a cancellation and the date was available, a Saturday in September, but they needed a deposit within 72 hours to hold it or it went to the next couple on the list. She had looked into it. She trusted it. She just needed to know if they were ready to commit. He said, "How much is the deposit?" She said, $3,400. He said, "Send me the venue details and I'll take care of it tonight." She sent him a website that looked exactly like the website of a real event venue, because she had spent 2 hours making sure it did. He looked at it on his phone, saw a beautiful space with good reviews and a professional layout, and transferred $3,400 to the account number she provided. 4 days later, she was gone. Her number worked for 36 hours, then it didn't. Her apartment she had always rented, he understood now, which had felt like practicality and was actually architecture, was empty when he drove past it. The healthcare administration company she had named had no record of her. The brother in Fort Worth did not appear to exist in any locatable form. The venue in Inman Park was a real venue with no knowledge of any booking in her name or his. He spent 3 weeks trying to reconstruct what had happened before a man named Quame, who attended a different campus of the same church network, called him out of nowhere and said, "I think something happened to you that happened to me." Quame had been through it 8 months earlier in Charlotte. Different name, she had been Adiz Nwasu in Charlotte. Different details on the surface, same architecture underneath. The vulnerability she had presented, the problems she had solved, the warmth that had not felt like performance because it wasn't entirely performance. The engagement, the deposit. Quaim had found a man named Rohan in Memphis. Rohan had found a man named Sterling in Nashville. Sterling had found two more. They were all in a group chat within a week of Terence's call to Quaim, 6 men in 5 cities, and the combined documented total was $231,000, and none of them had reported it because each of them had believed until that week that he was the only one, and the solitude of that belief had been its own kind of prison. She was in Atlanta again. That was what Sterling had found, a social media account she had been careless about, a church event tag indicator 2 weeks prior. A new name, the same operational shape. A man named Gordon Ibarra, trucking company in Norcross, getting married in 3 weeks. Terence drove to Decatur on a Saturday morning in June with $3,400 of transfer records on his phone and screenshots from 5 other men, and the specific knowledge of what Gordon Ibarra did not know yet but needed to. The broad-shouldered man in the cream suit had Terence by the arm now, moving him toward the sidewalk with the professional patience of someone who has handled disruptions before. Terence let himself be moved. He was not fighting anyone. He was talking. He said, "I know you think I'm the problem right now. I understand that. But give me 60 seconds with Gordon before you put me in a car. 60 seconds. If he hears what I'm saying and tells me to leave, I'll leave." The broad-shouldered man looked at him. There was something in Terence's face, not desperation, not instability, something older and quieter than both, that gave the man a half-second of genuine consideration. From somewhere behind the crowd, a woman's voice said, "Let him talk." The voice belonged to a woman in her late 60s in a deep purple dress, and she had the specific authority of someone who has been the person in her family who handles things for a very long time. Gordon's mother. She had been watching Terence from the moment he stepped into the road, and she had been listening to every word, and something in the specificity of what he was saying had been working on her. She made her way through the crowd. She held out her hand. She said, "Show me." Terence gave her his phone. She looked at the transfer records first. She looked at the timestamps, the amounts, the account information. She scrolled to the messages, the ones Celestine had sent him in the weeks before the engagement, the long ones, the specific ones, the ones that in their cadence and their phrasing and their careful architecture of vulnerability and warmth had a quality that was unmistakable once you were reading them in this context. She scrolled further and found the screenshots from Quaim, the ones from Rohan, the ones from Sterling, and she stopped at a message that Celestine had sent to Sterling in Nashville 18 months ago that was, in 3 full sentences, word for word identical to a message she had sent Terence in February. Gordon's mother looked up from the phone. She looked at the car. She looked back at Terence, and her expression had moved through several rooms and arrived somewhere that was not anger and was not grief, but was the specific face of a woman who has been right about something she did not want to be right about. She walked to the car and opened the door herself. Gordon Ibarra stepped out in his wedding suit and looked at the situation with the measured expression of a man who has been pulled out of the most important moment of his life and intends to resolve this quickly and return to it. He was 51 years old and had built his trucking company from 2 vehicles to a fleet of 38, and he had the bearing of a man who had solved a lot of problems and was accustomed to being the one who made things make sense. His mother handed him the phone. He stood on Glenwood Avenue in his wedding suit and read. The measured expression held for the first minute. Then it began to do something else. He scrolled and read and scrolled, and the something else deepened, and the crowd watched him process what was on that phone the way you watch a building absorb something before you know whether it will hold or not. At one point he stopped scrolling. He stood very still with his thumb resting on the screen and his eyes not moving, and the crowd waited and nobody said anything. He looked at his mother, she looked back at him. Something passed between them that had no sound. He walked to the car. He stood outside it for a moment with his hand on the door, not opening it. Then he opened it and leaned in and said something nobody else could hear. Celestina D's Nwasu stepped out of the car in her dress, and the first thing every person watching would remember afterward was how composed she was. She stood in the street in $4,000 worth of white fabric and looked at Terence Okafor with an expression that was not guilt and not defiance. It was the expression of someone making a rapid calculation and not yet having the result. Gordon looked at her for a long moment. He said, "How many?" She said nothing. He said it again, not loudly. The street was so quiet that everyone heard it anyway. Celestine looked at her groom in his beautiful suit on the day she had built, and she looked at Terence with his phone, and she looked at the crowd surrounding her on all sides, and she said nothing. Her silence went on long enough that it answered the question more completely than words could have. Gordon Ibarra nodded once slowly, the way you nod when you are integrating something you cannot yet fully feel. He turned to his family. He said, "We're not doing this today." He walked back through the crowd toward his family. He did not look at her again. 11 weeks later, she made the kind of mistake that people make when they have operated without consequence long enough to stop believing consequence is real. She rented an apartment in Columbia, South Carolina under her actual name for the first time in 3 years. That was enough. Her name was Adiz Celestine Okafor. She had been born in Houston in 1990, held a communications degree from the University of Houston, and had, by the time investigators finished their accounting across 5 states, taken money from 19 men over 3 years. The documented total was $267,000. Everyone involved understood the actual number was higher. How much higher? No one could say, because several of those men would never attach their names to any official record of what had happened to them. She was charged across 3 jurisdictions with wire fraud, theft by deception, and identity fraud. She pleaded not guilty and did not speak publicly. The men in the group chat sat with that in their own ways, and none of them found it satisfying, and all of them moved on because that was the only available direction. Gordon Ibarra gave one interview, 6 months after the arrest, to a journalist in Atlanta. He said the hardest thing was not the money. She had not gotten far enough with him financially for the amounts to be significant. The hardest thing, he said, was the 6 months of dinners and Sundays and ordinary evenings that he now had to hold differently. He said he had spent a month trying to identify the false moments, trying to locate the exact points where the performance was visible, and he had mostly failed. He said she had been genuinely good company. He said some of those evenings had been genuinely good evenings. He said, "I don't know what to do with the real parts. I keep trying to separate them from the false parts and they won't separate cleanly." He paused for a long time before he said the next thing. He said, "I've decided to stop trying. I've decided to let it be what it is, which is complicated, and to stop needing it to resolve into something I can file away." He said he had called Terence Okafor the week after the arrest. He said Terence had told him there was nothing to thank him for. He said Terence had said, "I just knew what was coming for you. I'd already been through it. I couldn't drive past that convoy and go home and watch the game." Terence, for his part, said the hardest part was not standing in the road. Standing in the road had taken 20 seconds of decision, and then it was just standing. The hardest part had been the 2.5 weeks between finding out about Gordon Ibarra's wedding and the Saturday morning he got in his car. He had spent those weeks arguing with himself every single day. He had thought about what he had already lost and what it would cost him to spend any more of himself on a situation that had already cost him enough. He had thought about the humiliation of being right and not being believed. He had thought about what men say about men who make scenes at other people's weddings. And then he had thought about Gordon Ibarra in his suit, on his wedding day, not knowing. He had thought about what he himself had needed someone to do for him 2 months earlier. On the evening, he sat on his own porch and transferred $900 to a woman who was already gone before she arrived. He had thought about what he would have wanted a stranger to be willing to risk. He said I didn't do it to be a hero. I did it because I knew what the inside of that felt like. And I couldn't unknow it. That's the only reason. You can't unknow something, and once you can't unknow it, the question is just what you're going to do about it. He paused. He said, I decided to do something about it. If this story reached something in you, share it with someone who needs it. And tell me in the comments, have you ever known something you couldn't unknow and had to decide what to do with it? I read every one. See you in the next one.